Speaking started.
Okay, so good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be, and welcome to this very special Zoom event, MENA Jews and the Holocaust. This event is being jointly presented by Harif, my organization, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. My name is Lyn Julius, and Harif, for those who don't know us, is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We are a small group of volunteers who aim to raise awareness of the history and culture of these Jews. Please do sign up to our mailing list at harif.org to keep up to date with our activities, which include a busy Zoom program. There is a common myth that the Holocaust only impacted Jews in Europe. But had the Nazis not been defeated at the Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, there is reason to believe that the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa would have shared the tragic fate of Jews in Europe. To give an outline of how different Jewish communities were affected by World War II, the Simon Wiesenthal Center has assembled a distinguished panel of experts. The presentation will take about an hour. Then there will be an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. To ask your question, please type it into the chat. This event is actually being recorded, and we will definitely make it available on our website, and of course Simon Wiesenthal will also circulate it. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Shimon Samuels of the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
Thank you, Lyn. If there is a missile siren and those of us in Israel have to run to the shelter, please take over my job here, at least for the 10 minutes of absence, okay? I was born in London about 2 weeks after VE Day. And I sort of grew up in this childhood obsession regarding water. 30 miles of channel water was what saved us, the Jews of Britain, 330,000 according to the Wannsee Protocol. And there were other factors, but that was the principal one that saved us from extermination. I am very interested in the what if factor in history. And Lyn has pointed out some of it, but I'd like also to say that the choice of the date of this Zoom, the 13th of May, really is a peg, because in 1943, on the 13th of May, Nazi Germany signed surrender in Tunis. So what if the campaign of the desert would have gone the other way? And as you have said, Lyn, the Jews of MENA, not only the Jewish Yeshuv are in Mandate Palestine, across the Middle East, all the way to Turkey and Iran. Hajj Amin el-Husseini's calls from Berlin for an intifada of sorts and genocide of all Jews could have definitely become a reality. So we have a panel of distinguished experts here, and that is the substance of our speakers. And we're beginning with Reeva Simon, who was former Associate Director of the Middle East Institute at Columbia University, is the author inter alia of the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, the impact of World War II, and she will address the situation in Algeria, Morocco, and Iran, or if you prefer, Persia. So, Reeva, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Shimon. Thank you, Wiesenthal Center and Harif for sponsoring this seminar. I'm going to do it in a different order. Iran, Algeria, Morocco, three very different countries. But all three suffered from food shortages and the deleterious wartime conditions. Iran and North African countries supplied food to Germany, resulting in shortages at home. At the same time, where they could, Jews in these countries assisted the Allies in the war effort and helped refugees from Nazi Europe. Iran. Iran was independent and ruled by the Shah of Iran, Reza Shah. He remained neutral. The Shah did not declare war on the Axis powers. I mean, don't forget that at the beginning of the war, there was an alliance between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. And Iran was vulnerable to a Russian invasion from the north. In 1907, Russia and Great Britain declared zones of influence in the country, Russia in the north and Britain in the south. So Reza Shah kept economic links with Germany, and there were Nazi agents in Iran. There was also trade. Iran transferred food and essential commodities for the war effort to Germany, and Germany was supposed to supply machinery for Iran's new factories. But by 1941, Iran no longer had a food surplus and was facing famine and didn't get the machinery. In September 1941, Britain and Russia invaded Iran and deposed the Shah, placing his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, on the throne. Britain wanted to ensure the flow of oil through the Persian Gulf to British troops in North Africa, and Russia needed a direct supply route, a reliable supply line from the Persian Gulf to Russia. Stalin, no longer allied with Germany, allowed Polish prisoners of war, mainly soldiers, to travel east through Russia and south to Iran, where they could join British forces. They received financial support from the Polish government in exile. Civilians joined the soldiers, and Iran became an eastern escape route from Nazi Europe. These included Jewish refugees on their way to Palestine. They didn't receive support and had to rely on the local Jewish community and the Joint Distribution Committee. There were about 80 to 100,000 Jews in Iran. The community could barely take care of its own poor. Nevertheless, Persian or Iranian Jews were the first responders to assist other Jews. They shared the food they had and helped with clothing, furniture, and medical care. There were some 800 Jewish children, known as the Tehran Children, who were in a separate camp and stayed in Iran for almost a year. The local Jewish community pitched in to support the children until the Joint and the Jewish Agency organized their transport to Palestine. In North Africa, there was a different story. Britain, the British, the Italians, and the Germans were engaged in a military campaign across the southern shore of the Mediterranean. Now, Algeria was actually part of France. Its three provinces sent representatives to the French National Assembly. And the French citizens of Algeria consisted of French colonists, where there was a considerable anti-Semitic component among them, and Jews. Jews had received French citizenship in 1870. Most Muslims were not French citizens. Jews in Algeria were becoming part of the French middle class. Many held jobs in the civil administration and in the professions and lived in the European sections of the cities. After the French surrendered in June 1940, Algerian Jews lost their French citizenship and were subject to French anti-Semitic regulations. These included things like dismissal from all government jobs, from justice of the peace to postal worker to transit worker. Jews couldn't be bankers or money changers, journalists, theatrical directors, couldn't work in radio, broadcasting. Businesses were Aryanized. There were quotas on Jewish members of the profession, such as medicine, pharmacy, and the law. Jewish students were expelled from government schools, and Jewish teachers could teach only in Jewish schools. Local Jews realized that they had to reorganize Jewish communal life to provide economic support for the approximately 30,000 impoverished Jews who had lost their jobs in businesses, and education for some 20,000 Jewish children who had been expelled from government schools. Jews also joined the resistance and assisted the Allies in Operation Torch, the North African landing. Some 300 young Jews, led by José Albuquerque, were instrumental in holding off troops until the Americans entered Algiers. Nevertheless, even after the Americans arrived in November 1942, some Jews were sent to labor camps. I'll talk about labor camps in a minute, but first, let's turn to Morocco. Morocco was under 3 different jurisdictions. Spanish Morocco and the International Zone of Tangier, there was little to no racial or religious persecution. There were also very few Jews there. And then there was French Morocco, where most Jews lived. When the French surrendered to Germany in June 1940, the Nazis occupied part of France and turned the southern part over to French rule at Vichy. The Vichy French were also given control of the French colonies, which meant that French territories in North Africa came under Vichy rule. There were about 200,000 Jews in Morocco, some indigenous Jews and subjects of the King of Morocco, some immigrants to Morocco. The Vichy French imposed similar anti-Semitic regulations on those in mainland France, which the king, Mohammed V, tried to mitigate for his Moroccan Jewish subjects. After all, as the Islamic sovereign of Morocco, he had to protect his Jewish subjects. So he did what he could. But in the cities, Jews still had to move into the old Jewish quarter, the Mellah, causing severe dislocation and a health crisis. But Morocco was also the Western escape route from Nazi Europe to the Americas. The local Jewish attorney, Hélène Cazès Benatar, organized and worked with international agencies to provide assistance to refugees. It is estimated that her network helped between 10,000 and 60,000 refugees. She also worked to have internees released from labor camps. It's estimated that there were between 50 and 60 internment and labor camps in Algeria and Morocco, and that between 14,000 and 15,000 Jews were interned at one time or another. There are no exact figures because there's no record of many of the internees because men who were stateless were, as a result, invisible to foreign relief organizations. The internees included demobilized Jewish soldiers who had volunteered to serve in the French army, Algerian political prisoners, refugees taken off of passenger ships, and people who had managed to find shelter in Algeria. There are also Jews from camps in southern France who had been grabbed in raids during the mass deportation of foreign Jews in August 1942, and who were sent as, quote, volunteers to labor camps in areas under French control in Morocco and Algeria. Men were also sent to work on what was known as the Trans-Saharan Railroad, a French plan to link Algeria and sub-Saharan Africa, where men had to lay track across more than 1,000 miles of desert in areas with high winds and little water, daytime temperatures reaching 125 degrees, followed by bitterly cold nights. Some lived in barracks, some in little more than holes in the ground. The camps were often run by anti-Semitic former legionnaires and local Arabs who tortured prisoners for the smallest infraction. In Algeria and Morocco, the situation for Jews didn't change very much because of the Allied landing. More than a year passed until the anti-Semitic regulations were lifted and the internees liberated from the camps. The Allies had much more important issues, end the war in Tunisia, and not to upset the status quo with the Muslim population. Thank you. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank
Shimon has muted himself, I think. Shimon.
No, I had 10 minutes. You know.
Hey, Shimon, do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, thank you. We now go to the other part of North Africa, and that is with David Mcnaughty, who was born in 1949, moved to Italy in 67. He is a clinical psychologist and chair of Holocaust studies at Roma Tre Università. He is also president of research on modern Jewish civilization and Israeli studies. David, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I begin to speak about Libya, and after some words about Tunis, different history, but very connected in that time. The condition of the Jews of Libya is different from other area of North Africa because the persecution began in 38 with the racist law applied in Italy, and the regime decided to extend the legislation in Libya. In the first time, the governor wanted to not to extend all the laws because the condition of the Jews in Libya was very important for the economy of the country, and in the same time, he was not completely agree with the politic of Mussolini on the racist law. He was very important, Parbo. He was a fascist, a very violent fascist, but in the same time, he cultivated the relationship with the Jewish community of Ferrara during years 20 and 13, also during the legislation against the Jews, expressed in public relationship with the Jews of Ferrara, the rich family of Ferrara, and also in Libya wanted to limitate the extension of the laws. But it was just a time because he died in 40, and in the same time, when Italy entered in the war, the legislation against the Jews was extended also because there were some different conditions of the Jewish community in Libya. First of all, we have had in Libya a part of the community, about 400 people with the British citizenship. So they were deported in Italy, in different camps in Italy, in the center of Italy. And in 44, they were deported to Bergen-Belsen and in other camps. They didn't die because they were British, and the Nazis wanted to make an exchange with the German soldiers. So for all the time they remained in Bergen-Belsen until 45. And when they came back in Libya, they, after a few days or few weeks, began the pogrom, the Arabic pogrom in 45. So for them, there was no time to change their life and to begin to live a different life. In 45, in November 45, in Libya, it was a very hard pogrom against all the Jewish community of the Tripolitania. Second, in Libya, we have had also a large group of Jews with the protégés français. And so they were deported to Tunis. And it was very hard life for them because in Tunis, as you know, for a time, we have had a direct presence of the Nazi in Tunis. So very different from Algeria and from Morocco, a direct presence and domination until May 43. Third aspect, in the area of the Cyrenaica, was the front of El Alamein. And so for a long time, you have had an advance of the British army and an advance of the Italian and Nazi army. So the front was very complicated, and Mussolini decided to deport all the Jews of the Cyrenaica. And so it was a big tragedy because all the community was deported in Jado. Jado is in the south of Tripolitania, about 180 kilometers, and 25% of the population of the Jewish community of Cyrenaica died in few months. And if the Allied didn't arrive after the war, after the Battle of El Alamein, I think that in few weeks, all the community would die for the situation of and for the condition and for other different aspects. So you have had a different history. So deportation of a part of the Jewish community, deportation in Italy for the British, and deportation in Tunisia for the French. And we have had also a fourth deportation, not so known. In Libya, before the Second World War, a group of Jews from Polish, from Romania, from Vienna, decided to travel until the future state of Israel, and they decided to stop in Libya because it was not possible to enter in Eretz Israel, and so they decided to stay in Libya, and from Libya to go privately in a group in clandestinity to Israel. And so they stayed in Libya for a time. They about 300 people, more than 300 people. They stayed in Libya. They were helped by the Jewish community of Tripolitania and Benghazi, in particular in Benghazi, because they stayed in the area of the Cyrenaica. But when the war exploded, the regime decided to deport this population in Italy. And so they were deported in the south of Italy, in a camp created by the Italian regime for the foreigners, the Jews living in Italy. So it was a camp of Tarsia in Calabria, and this group of Jews were deported there, and they stayed until the liberation. Some people were deported in the north, and so the people that left the camp or were deported in the north of Italy after the occupation of the Nazi, they were deported in Germany or in Auschwitz or in other area. But the people that remained in the south, they were saved. And now I am researching about some personal history, because also in Israel, some families, survived family, wrote about their history in the south of Calabria and in Libya. So it is a very interesting history that I listened for my mother, and after I began to collect some aspect of this mosaic, very interesting mosaic of Jews coming from the north of Europe in Libya to go to Israel. And so for them, it was not possible. They were deported with the Esperia Navy of Italy. This is very important, and the liberation arrived in Tripolitania after the Battle of El Alamein. For the Jews of Libya, it was a time of hope, a very messianic, expectative, and they were dreaming also a different life, but in fortified for different aspects that I explored in Jewish Libya. It was a very hard pogrom, and the second pogrom in 48, and between 49 and 21, 22, all the Jewish community left Libya. 85% of the population decided to emigrate to Israel, and they changed their life there. It was very hard life in Israel, but it is a very important particular history. In Tunisia, we have a different situation. In Tunisia, Tunisia was a protection area of a French in 1881, and two different communities. One, the Twansi, the original population of the Jews in Tunisia. They arrived in Tunisia from a long time. There are some legends about the presence of stone of the first temple in Jerba. So a very interesting history of the Jews of Tunisia, about 100,000 people during that time. And in the same time, we have a different community of Jews from Sepharad, but they arrived in Tunisia from Livorno. So they were in connection with the Italian culture, and there were two different communities with the different organizations, different cemeteries also, different shohat also. So a very interesting history. The group of the Jews of Italy or from Sepharad living in Tunisia were called the Grana. This is their name, a very cosmopolitic community. And during the persecution of the Vichy regime, not Vichy regime, the Nazi presence also there, it was a very complicated situation because this group was an Italianist group. So the Italian regime was obliged to protect them because if the French began to rob them, the Italians were in a bad position because they were present in the banks, in the insurances, and they were very connected with the Italian economy and with the Italian culture. So the persecution in particular was extended to the Twansa and with some camps, and we know that about 46 people died in the camps in Tunisia. In the camp of Jado, 25% of the Jews of Cyrenaica were about 600 people less died in Jado. In Tunisia, the situation was very complicated by the direct presence of the Nazi and the propaganda of the Nazi. And after when the Nazi left Tunisia, we have had some direct violence or robbery by the Muslim population. The Nazi propaganda was very hard in Tunisia, and we can see in 1945 the presence of people coming from Tunisia to reach Israel for the war against Israel organized by the Arab states in after the independence of Israel in May 1948. I think that the propaganda of the Mufti created in North Africa a very complicated situation because it was a propaganda in Arabic. And in this propaganda of the Mufti and the group of Rashid Ali and others from Berlin and from Bari, they make an equation between Hitler and the Mahdi. So Hitler was presented in this propaganda as a Muslim messiah. The Mahdi in Arabic is like the Messiah in the Jewish tradition. It is not the same, but just to understand what does it mean and how this propaganda extended in North Africa created the situation, very complicated situation of hate after the war. So it was connected with the violence in period between 45 and 48. So this is an aspect that I think it is important to explore. So I stop here because perhaps after we will have time to say something more.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And also, I must say that you are a very good friend of the Wiesenthal Center, so thank you. The next speaker, Yves Fedida. I've known him since childhood, high school at least. He was born in Alexandria in 1945. His family were expelled from Nasser's Egypt in '56, following the Suez Crisis. In 2002, he co-founded the International Nebi Daniel Association for the Preservation of Jewish Religious and Cultural Heritage in Egypt. Yves, the floor is yours.
Fine. Can you hear me? Fine.
Yes.
I'd like, if I may, to present my talk with a PowerPoint. Is that possible?
Yes, I'll allow you to share screen in 1 minute, okay?
Okay, and before that, I would just like to have a quick thought for all our brothers and sisters in Israel and all those poor people in Gaza who are completely innocent and only want to live their lives on a normal basis. You know, whilst we talk, some people are suffering, and we should have a kind thought for them. Okay, can I share my screen now?
Absolutely.
Fine. Right, it's a PowerPoint. I'll do it on a screen-by-screen basis. I don't know how I can collapse this. Can I collapse the pictures? Yeah, okay. So in I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to say, thank God I was born in Egypt and not in Libya or Tunisia and Algeria or Morocco. And there is something that I'd like to come to this, to the presentation in a different way, because the fight against Nazism in Egypt has started well before the war. And in 1936, the founder of the Egyptian LICA, Ligue Internationale contre l'Antisémitisme, the lawyer Léon Castro, said before 1,500 people at the synagogue in Alexandria, if Hitler does not fall, 3 million Polish Jews, 1 million Romanian Jews, and a few other hundreds of thousands of Jews in Hungary and Austria will be lost. We all realize now that he was missing a few countries and was only 1 million short. As many countries in the, how do I go to the next screen? Ah, okay, sorry. As many countries in the MENA countries, the Egyptian Jewish press in French and Arabic were acutely aware of the dangers and were very vocal about them as early as 1932. Albert Mosseri, the owner of Israel, started warning people in 1932, before Hitler came to power. They waged an information battle denouncing Nazism and appealed to ban its activities in Egypt. This was an example of l'Aurore, which is a call to the government to suppress Nazism in Egypt. Jews were divided about the boycott that was organized for German goods, since even the Jewish agency at the time was selling German goods because of the Heskem Ha'avara agreement. In April '33, thousands of Jews gathered to demonstrate at the Cairo synagogue and the Alexandria synagogue. They managed to garner the support of the non-Jewish press and non-Jewish personalities who relayed their worries. In May 1933, 4,000 Muslims and Christians demonstrated in Alexandria in solidarity with their Jewish friends. The LISCA, which is the Ligue Internationale Scolaire contre l'Antisémitisme, was formed to include non-Jewish students. 1,500 strong German community was very much pro-Hitler. Through the Deutsche Verein and the NSDAP headed by Alfred Hess, that's Rudolf's brother, they distributed multilingual anti-Semitic brochures. And this was the first attempt at discriminating Jews and setting them apart from other minorities in the mosaic that was Egypt. One of their leaders, Willem van Meteren, the Siemens manager for the Middle East, published in German and French, Zur Judenfrage in Deutschland, a piece of pure hate and fake. The Egyptian government took a stand. The German-Jewish fight had no place in neutral Egypt. Germany had, of course, counter-threatened to boycott Egyptian cotton. But Nazi propaganda started linking Jews with events in Palestine, and the Waft Party, created in 1919, which included Jews, by the way, warned Jews that persistence with the boycott to help their European brothers implied a mirror help for their own Arab brothers in Palestine. Unique in the Middle East and North Africa, and I think there was only one other example in Europe, which I think was in Bern. The Jews started a string of legal battles, which kept the attention of the press. Umberto Jabez, an Italian Jew, introduced a libel suit against Willem van Meteren's Zur Judenfrage in Deutschland. The journalist Maurice Farjeon wrote a pamphlet, Le Tyran Moderne, denouncing Meteren's portrayal of Jews as assassins, parasites, and degenerates. He also added a few niceties about Hitler and his mother. The Deutsche Verein sued him, naturally. The Jewish parties, unfortunately, both lost their case on points of law. Deutsche Verein also sued Kadima, and the Italian embassy sued Israel, both two newspapers who folded a few months later. The fact is that these actions helped information against Nazism stay in the news for at least 6 years. Jews were confident that history would be the ultimate judge, even if the cases were lost. But meanwhile, in 1937, people the likes of Goebbels, Rudolf Hess, or Baldur von Schirach, this is the guy who said, when I hear the word Kultur, I pull out my gun, started springing up. A clear consequence of these visits is evident in the 1938 demonstrations. They featured typically Nazi-inspired hate-mongering propaganda. Down with the Jews, throw the Jews out of Egypt and Palestine were vociferated by Cairo University students, mostly friends of the Muslim Brotherhood founded in 1928 in Egypt, and also friends of Misr al-Fatat, Young Egypt, which espoused fascist ideals. This was in sympathy, obviously, with the Arab rebellion in Palestine, which was going on at the time. All of a sudden, people realized that war was not a European exclusivity. The Africa Corps arrived in Tripoli in February 48, taking over from the Italian troops which had tried to penetrate Egypt at Sidi Barani, but were pushed back by the Brits. The Desert War set in. Alexandria was the headquarters of the British fleet, was regularly bombed. In June 41, 200 people died in a bombing. The next day, 40,000 people were evacuated to the provinces or to Cairo, amongst them 2,000 Jews. All of a sudden, the Nazis were knocking at the door. During the first Battle of El Alamein in 1942, SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Rauff is in Athens. He's rearing in the winds, ready to enact the final solution in Egypt and Palestine. Radio Berlin calls on Egyptians to note the addresses of Jews, since Germany would rid Egypt and Palestine of the Jews and the British. Panic sets in everywhere. In Cairo, the British embassy starts burning its documents. Affluent Jewish families leave for other countries to the south or to Palestine. Others are convinced that Muslims will turn against them and they start hoarding for a siege. The Germans are stopped, but not defeated, a mere 85 kilometers from Alexandria's suburbs. But at the second Battle of El Alamein, from 23rd of October to 3rd of November, Rommel's logistics fail him and Montgomery outsmarts him. Baruch Hashem. 85 kilometers is what separated us from the Holocaust. 85 kilometers, the distance from Tel Aviv to Beersheba, from Oxford to London, from Paris to Orléans to Chartres even. The Jews in Egypt were saved, but not so the Jews from Egypt, who were trapped in France and who were sent to death camps. This is the list that is on the synagogue wall in Paris. Throughout this period, funds were raised by Jews of Egypt and land was bought in Israel. 12,000 Jews from Europe were helped to settle there. Refugees were taken to refugee camps and or helped to immigrate into Eretz Israel by small boats or across the desert from Port Said. Sick German or Austrian Jews on their way from Italy to Shanghai, for instance, were treated on the boats in Port Said. Non-Jewish Egyptians generously participated in these medical efforts. Only a small minority of Jews were Zionists at the time. A training farm was established for the Hechaluts. Some collected arms from the battlefield for the Haganah. And in April 46, hundreds of young Egyptian Jews organized a daring operation called Rakevet Pesach. Disguised as British soldiers returning from leave, they boarded a train to Palestine. They founded Kibbutz Bror Hayil. After the 48-49 war, Farouk and the Arab League call on the German general Arthur Schmidt to train an army of 1 million men. He would soon be followed by many other military advisors, principally attached to the War Ministry. Nasser, however, took things further. He brought them in to train the Fedayeen, the security services, and the police. The Propaganda and Information Ministry were also gratified with Nazi experts. A Jewish section with Judenreferenten is set up at the Information Ministry. Asylum is granted temporarily to Alois Brunner and permanently to other horrors such as Aribert Heim and Hans Eisler. German scientists are recruited for the Egyptian missile and aircraft program. The US congressional proceedings of 21st of March 1957 on the treatment of Jews in Egypt reads, the dexterity and speed with which the Nasser government moved against its Jewish population indicates that practiced hands have been guiding this campaign. Here we have a list of some of those guiding hands, the Judenreferenten, active Nazi experts of all kinds, and those simply living a life of leisure in Egypt. The Nazis may have guided, but they did not decide the demise of Jews in Egypt. They were only role models and instructors. Luckily, the Egyptians stopped short of murder or mass murder. Some say the authorities were complicit in the hand of terror which torched the Ashkenazi synagogue in November 45. In June 48, a dozen Jewish homes were blown up in the Hara. 22 died, and bombs caused extensive damage in the Jewish department stores Oreco and Sicurel. In September 48, 19 19 Jews are killed, 62 wounded. In January 52, over 600 million euros in today's terms of Jewish property is destroyed. This was relatively mild compared to certain other MENA countries. However, the hand of government struck differently. On 14th of May, 1948, 2,000 youngsters were interned for periods of 6 months to 2 years. Jewish youngsters. In November 56, over 900 Jews were arrested for up to 6 months. And yet again, all adult males, over 500 of them, were jailed in 1967 in horrific conditions for up to 3 years. The process of Egyptianization mirrored point to point the German process of Aryanization, except for the mass murder. The following will strike a chord. Arrests were purely on the basis of religion, not nationality. Egypt was the first and only Arab state to use internment camps without trial against its own Jewish citizens and Jews of other nations. Denaturalization or refusal to grant citizenship. 45% of the Jews became or stayed stateless. Limitative company laws in 1947. Extraction of nominative lists from Jewish institutions. Numerous closures in universities and the civil service. Economic harassment, misappropriation of property through duress, sequestration of property were part of our lot. Restrictions to leave the country versus internments with a liberation on condition of leaving the country. Because of the heterogeneous makeup of the community and different nationalities, families were separated through immediate expulsions. Departures were generally accompanied with humiliation of one sort or another. Finally, there are now only 5 Jews left from the old community of Egypt. 2,500 years of uninterrupted presence in the land is coming to an end. The anti-Semitic venom lives on without Jews, not only in books or the press. The Egyptian government has repeatedly turned a deaf ear to the demands of exiled Jews concerning their Jewish patrimony. And if Egypt can make peace with Israel, can it not reconcile itself with its Jews? That's it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Yves. That was quite a learning experience. Thank you. Now, Lyn Julius, daughter of Jewish refugees from Iraq, a journalist and founder of Harif. Her book, and I think she could wave it, and so did I, Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight, has been published in several languages and soon to appear in Arabic. Lyn.
Right, well, I will summarize what happened in the Levant and in Iraq. So that is Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. So with the outbreak of war, the Jews of Palestine vowed to set aside their differences, the differences with the British. The Yishuv was incensed that the white paper of 1939 envisaged the Jews as a minority in an Arab state. Ben-Gurion declared, "We shall fight the white paper as if there was no war, and the war as if there was no white paper." The Yishuv was actually fighting on 2 fronts. They aided the British, especially in special operations in the Levant. At the same time, they tried to help as many Jewish refugees reach Palestine as possible and run the British shipping blockade. The Haganah and the Irgun decided to fight alongside the British. Some 40,000 Jews volunteered to join the British Army. The British at first were reluctant to accept Jewish fighting men and wanted an equal number of Arabs to join the British Army. But 15 times as many Jews wanted to join the British as Arabs. The British also feared that if they trained Jewish fighters, these would eventually turn against the British. It was only in 1944 that the Jewish Brigade was established, in which 5,000 Palestinian Jews served under the Zionist flag, initially in Libya, where they had quite an impact on the Jewish community there. The period 1940 to 42 saw intense fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Tel Aviv and Haifa were periodically bombed by the Axis. Hundreds of civilians were killed. In the spring of 1941, it looked as if the Nazis were winning the war, so much so that the leaders of the Yishuv made plans for a government in exile to be evacuated to the US or South Africa. The Nazi threat intensified in the summer of 1942, but even when it receded, there was a persistent fear of Nazi-sponsored sabotage or an Arab attack on Palestine. Throughout the Middle East, Arab public opinion was mostly pro-German. The 1930s saw the establishment of ultra-nationalist parties like the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, inspired by Nazism. In Syria, demonstrators chanted, "No more Monsieur, no more Mister, in heaven Allah, on earth Hitler." In 1941, the British had a plan to sabotage the Haifa-Mosul pipeline to prevent Hitler securing the oil for his imminent invasion of Russia. Palestinian Jews cooperated with the British by infiltrating secretly into Syria. It was in one such operation that the famous General Moshe Dayan lost an eye. On the 8th of June, 1941, the British invaded Syria, defeating the Vichy regime. The local Jews were thus spared the full impact of the Vichy anti-Semitic laws. Although in the British sphere of influence, Iraq became a center of militarism and pan-Arab nationalism in the 1930s. It presented the British with another headache in April 1941. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem, accompanied by an entourage of some 400 Palestinians and Syrians, had been in Iraq since 1939. He became kingmaker of the Iraqi government, and together with a group of army officers and headed by the nationalist politician Rashid Ali al-Galani, he engineered a pro-Nazi coup. The coup leaders declared an alliance with the Axis and war on the British. Had the Nazi coup succeeded, there is reason to believe that a Holocaust could have been perpetrated in Iraq. So thinly stretched were the British in Iraq, as most of their troops were engaged in fighting Rommel in North Africa, that they requested help from the Irgun. The Irgun commander, David Raziel, agreed to help on condition that he could capture the Mufti. He was dispatched to Iraq, but was killed when his car was strafed by a Luftwaffe plane. It took 30 days for the British to capture the Air Force base at Habaniya and defeat the Iraqis, putting the Mufti and his acolytes to flight. But on the 1st and 2nd of June, 1941, following sustained Nazi propaganda and incitement, branding the Jews as collaborators with the British, the Jewish community, who had been in Iraq for 2,600 years and constituted a quarter of the inhabitants of Baghdad, were subject to a terrible massacre, the Farhud, which is the Arabic word for forced dispossession. There were at least 179 identified dead We will never know the final tally because some Jews were poisoned in hospitals and others were thrown into the river. There were 1,000 injured, 900 shops and businesses were looted, as well as hundreds of homes. There was terrible rape and mutilation. The British Army was stationed at the gates of Baghdad. It could have intervened to quell the violence, but stood by because they did not want to appear to be reoccupying the country. The Farhud proved to be the death knell of the 2,600-year-old Jewish community. It was primarily fear of a second Farhud, which caused 90% of the 150,000 member community to flee to Israel in 1950. Today, there are just 3 Jews living in Iraq. The Mufti spent the rest of the war in Berlin, where he broadcast vicious anti-Jewish propaganda. An ideology of genocidal and Islamized anti-Semitism born in the Nazi era is still with us today. And the events of this week, I think, illustrate this, as Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which itself was born in the Nazi era, and anti-Semitism was really at the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy. So on that note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lyn. We now turn to our final speaker, Rifat Bali.
That was about 5 minutes.
He is based in Istanbul, author of numerous books on Ottoman and modern Turkey, associate member of the Alberto Benvenisti Center for Sephardic Studies at the Paris Sorbonne, and winner of its 2009 award for his publications on Turkish Jewry. Also, we've known each other, I think, for years. Rifat.
Yes, right. Thank you, Shimon. Good evening to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this Zoom seminar. I will speak about Turkish Jews during World War II. It's a 3-part short speech. One, I will put in context the situation of Turkish neutrality during World War II. Secondly, the situation of Turkish Jews in Turkey. And finally, the attitude of Turkey towards European Jews who tried to transit through Turkey to Palestine. So I will start first by giving a summary of Turkish neutrality and delicate balance during World War II. What I will be speaking now is a short summary from the National Archives of Maryland, where there is an extensive group of records concerning Holocaust era assets and where Turkey is also included. Turkey began World War II bound to England and France by the military alliance of October 1939, moved to non-belligerency in June 1940 after the fall of France, and adopted a policy of active neutrality in the spring of 1941 after German occupation of the Balkans and the conclusion of a German-Turkish Treaty of Friendship on June 1941. The Germans had substantial economic interest in Turkey. There were 2 banks, the Deutsche Bank and the Deutsche Orient Bank, who had branches in Istanbul. More than 60 German-controlled firms were engaged in trade, transportation, and industry in Turkey. These 2 German banks took advantage of the high prices on the Turkish free gold market to sell looted gold provided by the Reichsbank in return for foreign currency. Profits from the bank's Turkish gold trade were used to finance not only Germany's diplomatic espionage and propaganda activities in Turkey, but also the operation of various other Axis and Axis-friendly legations. In October 1941, Germany concluded a trade agreement with Turkey that provided for an exchange of Turkish raw materials, especially chromite ore for German war material, together with iron and steel products and manufactured goods. The aim was to draw Turkey further into the Axis orbit. In 1943, Turkey provided essentially 100% of German requirements for chromite ore. During most of the war, Turkey tried to balance the needs and expectations of Germany and the Axis on the one hand, and those of the Allies on the other. While being a major trading partner with Germany, Turkey maintained its friendly relations with the Allies, which provided Turkey with modern military equipment and which sought to minimize the effect of Turkey's export to Germany by preclusively buying products, especially chromite, at exceedingly high prices. Turkey successfully managed to remain neutral after all this balancing act. Now let's have a look to Turkey's treatments of its own Jewish citizens. Turkey's attitude towards its own Jewish citizens was a mixture of xenophobia and anti-Semitic feelings. Turkish Jews were constantly criticized in the press of speaking Ladino or French that they learned at Alliance schools instead of Turkish in public spaces, of not being loyal to the fatherland, of being ungrateful to Turkey, who welcomed their ancestors expelled from Spain in 1492. The humoristic journals of the epoch were filled with anti-Semitic cartoons similar to the same Nazi iconography that you found in Nazi journals of the same epoch. The local heroes were two Turkish Jewish characters, Solomon and his wife Rebecca. Both characters spoke Turkish with a heavy Jewish accent. Solomon had a crooked nose and hated baiting. Rebecca was fond of luxury and always chasing Jewish businessmen who were rich due to their war-profiteering deals. Turkey's bad treatment of its non-Muslim minorities reached a peak point with two consecutive events between the years 1941-1944. In 1941, non-Muslim reserve soldiers were conscribed into the Turkish army. They were not given arms and were enlisted in labor battalions for road construction work. The undisclosed reason of this decision was the fear that the Armenian minority would collaborate with the Nazis in case Germany decided to invade Turkey, and the Armenian would act as a fifth column. Therefore, the Turkish authorities, who wanted not to appear as treating Armenians in a discriminatory way, decided to conscribe all non-Muslim men, not only Armenians, to labor battalions. They would be released in July 42. 4 months later, in November 42, the wealth tax law, varlık vergisi, was accepted by the Turkish parliament. The law intended to tax profits generated by profiteering and black market operations. De jure, the law was not discriminatory, but de facto, it was applied in an arbitrary and discriminatory basis. Non-Muslim business owners were taxed 10 or 20 times more than their Muslim counterparts with equal wealth levels. Taxpayers were given a few weeks to pay the attributed taxes. This resulted in a race to liquidate businesses and the states at extremely ridiculously low prices for paying the taxes. If the taxpayers were unable to pay their debts, tax officers seized their estate and put it on sale through auctions. Taxpayers who refused or did not have the means to pay the taxes were by law ordered to be sent to labor camps in the eastern border of Turkey, near the Russian border, under minus 30 degrees centigrade. They were supposed to pay their debts against a minimal daily wage by shoveling snow and cleaning the roads. Only non-Muslim taxpayers who could not pay were sent to labor camps. Muslim taxpayers who could not pay were not sent. The non-Muslims who were in these camps were paid a ridiculously low wage for their work, which means that in order to pay their tax debts, they would have to work for decades. In September 1943, Cyrus Sulzberger, the editor of New York Times, published a 4-part series in the New York Times disclosing for the first time the situation of the non-Muslim taxpayers to the Western world. Subsequently, in December 43, non-Muslim taxpayers were released from the labor camps. Most of them were ruined and had to restart their business life from zero or work as an employee in their old businesses, which were taken for some ridiculous amount over by Muslim Turkish entrepreneurs. Some of them died in the labor camps due to the harsh winter conditions. These two consecutive events, in a way, triggered the mass emigration of Turkish Jews to Israel in 1948, 1949. It's about 45,000 Turkish Jews out of a total population of 80,000 who emigrated in 2 years to Israel. Now let's have a look to Turkey's attitude toward European Jewish immigrants who tried to reach Palestine by transiting through Turkey. Turkey's attitude was very strict. Turkey only gave permission to refugees who possessed visas to enter Palestine. Those who did not were sent back. A tragic example is the Struma vessel with 769 Romanian Jews. They did not have visas to enter Palestine and were not given permission to disembark in Turkey and were sent back to the Black Sea. The vessel was torpedoed by Soviet submarines and except for one passenger, all of them perished. The story that has been repeated continuously that Turkish diplomats saved Turkish Jews who were formerly Turkish citizens living under Nazi-occupied countries is also a very much exaggerated story. So far, there has been only one diplomat recognized as Rightus Gentile by Yad Vashem. He is Selahattin Ülkümen, Consul General of Rhodes. The other so-called saviors are exaggerated stories used to enhance Turkey's image abroad since the last 20 years. That's all I can say. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Now I will pass the program over to Lyn and Lawrence, who will be responsible for Q&A.
Yes, please do write your questions in the chat. We've had a few comments about people whose fathers have actually served in the British Army during the war. I think that was fantastic. Perhaps, Yves, you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, my father was enlisted in the British Navy in Alexandria, and he served both in Alexandria for a while, in Haifa and in Eritrea. When I tried to look for his records at the Naval Office, they'd written down that he'd served on HMS Sphinx. And the guy who saw that was really laughing because it was really HMS Sphinx, which meant that he was basically on the shore in Alexandria. But the great thing about the memory that I have of my father serving in the British Navy is that he was given a prayer book, which was a very liberal prayer book with the essential Jewish prayers. And the first thing that when you open the prayer book, that you read is prayer before going into battle. So that was really very frightening for me when I saw that. But anyway, he survived, and I was born, and Alamein made the sparkle in his eyes was transformed after Alamein. So that's it.
David Mcnaughty, can you comment on the role of the Italian soldiers in North Africa?
But the presence of the Italian soldiers were a large presence. Also in El Alamein, the presence of the soldiers were very large, and they were combating against the British army without the same structures of the Germans. So their position were different. And also in the area of the Maghreb, they combated, they fight until the last days of the war. And they were considered by the Italians also today, also in a different situation. In Italy, we have many people that have a large and a great, not identification, but sympathy with this army, because the army was destroyed there and many people died, and there is a big cemetery in El Alamein, and also the president of the Italian Republic visited the cemetery. What we can say that the war in the Maghreb was very difficult because the Americans were not prepared for that. The Germans army and also the Italian army were very able to fight against the liberator. So it was not so easy also in the area of Algeria and Tunis until the last day. For a long time, the Americans and the British were in a very difficult situation until the last days, and many prisoners the Germans made many prisoners in different battles. It was very complicated war, and it takes time, and this was a reason that the invasions from Normandy it takes time for that. It was a long discussion between Churchill and the Americans about Normandy, and Churchill wanted that fast liberation of North Africa.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because you cannot fight in two different fronts. And so the first objective was liberation of North Africa. So this is very important because the liberation of North Africa was the condition for the liberation of West Europe, of French from Normandy and another area. So the project of Hitler was to occupy the Middle East from the Caucasus, and so Stalingrad was stopped there, and to occupy the Middle East from Cyrenaica. Mm-hmm. So it was a very tragic project, mm-hmm. And for a long time, the British was not so aware to be able to win. For it was a time also to leave temporarily the area of the Middle East. And so it was a project also in Haifa for the Yishuv to organize themselves like the Armenians during the destruction by the Turkish army in the First World War. So
thank you very much for that. Can we go to Joe Samuels? You had a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I want to thank you for this important and crucial Zoom that you are doing. I was born in Baghdad. I was 10 years old at the time of the Farhud, and it was a terrible time that we all faced, the Jews of Baghdad. The people that came in, it was like the unimaginable violence that we faced. The writers raped, maimed, killed, and looted many of the Jewish property. So we were living in the Jewish quarters, but we moved a year earlier, and the writer did not reach our home, but of course my two uncles' properties homes were looted, and they managed to escape with their lives from jumping from roof to roof. Throughout the night, we heard guns and women's screams, and then suddenly stops. So unfortunately, we had a terrible experience till the British came in on the 31st of May. The coup started in April 1. 2 months later, the British arrived, and as Lyn said, they did enter the city. So the writers became, they looted the Jews and killed. The 178 people dying that officially were killed because they were identified, bodies that were identified. But the fact is, many of them were thrown in the river, or some of them they could not identify until they waited for the Iraqi troops to come in to Baghdad on June 2nd. That was Tuesday, which was a Shavuot, and they were waiting for the Iraqi and the Kurdish, and they came in and they created they killed some of the writers, and then established the peace and quiet in Baghdad.
Yeah.
But then,
well, thank you very much for that, Joe. Just to say, we are actually organizing a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Farhud, which falls this year. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Dangoor Education, the Spanish Synagogue in Montreal, and about 25 organizations are all supporting this commemoration. All details on the Harif website. It's on the 30th of May, 5 o'clock UK time. Can I ask a question to Reeva, actually? And that is, how would you assess the impact of Nazi propaganda on Morocco and Algeria after the war? Or, you know, what effect do you think it had? And were these Arabs, were they persecutors, were they bystanders, or were they saviors?
Okay, in terms of Nazi propaganda, we have to remember that the French colonists, the Pieds Noirs, many of them were anti-Semites, and certainly in Algeria, they worked they were vociferous in their demands that Jewish citizenship be revoked. Because Jews got French citizenship, Algerian Jews got French citizenship in 1870, and they were working from 1870 on to revoke French citizenship for Algerian Jews. So you had clearly anti-Semitic propaganda in Algeria and in Morocco from early times, certainly from the 1920s and 1930s. You also had some Muslims who wanted to work against Nazism because they saw that Hitler's Mein Kampf placed the Arabs only a rung above the Jews, and clearly some of them were outspoken in saying that, well, look, if Hitler wins and massacres the Jews, we might be next. Clearly they were very few in number, and clearly generally speaking, the Muslims stayed out of the conflict in Algeria and Morocco, because both were occupied by Vichy France, and the Muslims stayed out of it. Did propaganda play a role in subsequent attacks on Jewish communities and so forth? I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did, because clearly it was there. Direct connections. I don't know about direct connection, but clearly there was anti-Semitic propaganda in both countries.
Mm-hmm. And certainly the big pogrom in Libya in 1945,
Well, that's a
David.
different issue. Yeah,
Would you say Nazi propaganda played a role in causing that? Ah, well, he's unmuted. Sorry, can you unmute David Meghnagi?
Yeah, he's muted himself.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and then we've got Lavana who wants to ask a question immediately after that. We haven't
Right.
forgotten you, Lavana, don't
Yeah.
worry.
Okay.
No, no.
Sorry, I just asked David.
No,
that
what
question.
was yes,
Okay.
because Yves answered, but partly. I wanted to ask
Oh,
Yves.
just one second.
Oh,
I
sorry.
just asked David Meghnagi to answer my question about the causes of the 1945 Libyan pogrom.
It was a big combination. First of all, the Nazi propaganda, this is my hypothesis, had a place because the Arabic propaganda from Bari was listened in all North Africa by the Arabs, first of all. Second, the nationalistic organization after the liberation came back to Tripoli and Libya, and they brought with them the ideology of the Arab nationalism and the Muslim nationalism against the Jews. This is the second point, very important. Third point, in the locality of Tripolitania, of Tripoli, many Arabs came from Tunisia, and they were anti-Semitic. And in Tunisia, we know that it was a large presence of the Nazis for many months. So this was another aspect. Fourth aspect, I think that the tragedy of the pogrom and the nationalistic Arab mentality was an affirmation of identity. So there's a fourth aspect, not so well known, but we can see it in all the Arabic world, was not connected directly with the war in the Middle East. The war of the Middle East was just a part of the problem. The second problem was the emancipation of the Jews from the Arabic rule. And the emancipation of the Jews in North Africa came from European colonialism. So if you can make an analogy with the liberation of the Jews of Germany by Napoleon, for the Germans, the liberation and the emancipation of the Alsatian Jews was identified with the enemy of the liberation of the German peoples. So I think many aspects many aspects was worked, and I think that the British was not so able in the first days to stop the pogrom. It was very hard for the Jewish community because was the for 3 days, and for the population in the little towns was very hard. But between 45 and 48, the Jewish community, thanks to the presence of the Jewish soldiers also from the Yishuv, the connection, the contacts, organized themselves for the second pogrom. And in the pogrom of 48, it was very different completely. The Jews were very organized with battles of young and women organized themselves by the community.
Yes.
And
I'll stop you there, David. Thank you very much for that explanation. Levana, would you like to put your question?
Yes. Well, I would like to ask Yves, who is a very dear friend and who knows so much about the history of Jews in Egypt. I was born in Egypt also and left in '62. So about his father's being enlisted in the British Army, because there were many British citizens in Egypt among the Jews, and were there other examples? I never heard of that. Yes. And I'm a bit surprised. I mean, I want to know more about it, well, because Egypt on the whole, from what I know, from my,
let me show you, can I show you a picture?
Yes, but then I want to ask more, yes.
Let me show you, can I share the screen here?
Yeah, give me a second. Screen share is enabled again, yep.
Yeah. Okay. This is the V-Day celebration at the Eliyahu Hanabi synagogue, and you can see how many sailors and army people are there together with our rabbis. So obviously the Jews, these were not only Egyptian Jews. There were a lot of them were British Jews or Anzac Jews who were actually living in Egypt at the time. And this is, by the way, my father as a sailor with the Ministry of Defense thing, and giving his details. And you can see in Egypt all these. This is a picture I took off Facebook.
Oh yes,
a number
about
of
the
British soldiers.
The British soldiers, I know they were all over, and Cairo, and even married in my family. But
sure, but I think it depended on whether the people were of age to participate. If they were of age and they were registered as British nationals with the consul, they were called up. You weren't protected because you were there.
I know, but for example, the Addis family, we lived in the Addis building. Yes. That was burned down in '52 because being British and Jewish, like many others. Well, I never heard that the Addis family, who had sons, were enlisted.
I don't know what's
really. I'm very impressed, and I would like to know more about it, because the fight was intense, especially before the war, and with both the German Secret Service and the British Secret Service. I mean, Egypt was really a land of fight, of war, without active war.
We'll have to find out more about that, Levana.
Yes,
can I just go to Zahra? Zahra, are you there?
Zahra?
I think she disappeared.
Oh, she's unmuted herself. Sorry, Zahra.
Where are you? And Reeva would like to say something.
Yeah, just elaborate on the point that David made about decolonialization. The Jews in North Africa were caught between support for the French and support for independence. Yeah. And you can see that specifically in Algeria, where you had Jews fighting on both sides, fighting with the Muslims, Algerian nationalists, and fighting or leaving and fighting for France. So I think that's a major element that it was held in abeyance during the conflict, during World War II, and came to the fore immediately after World War II, when Muslims of the region began to fight for emancipation.
Thank you for that. We go to Zahra, our friend in Alexandria.
Hi, how are you? Lyn, how are you? Hope you are doing well.
We're very
nice to see you today.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mainly, as I told you before, I'm a tour guide, and mainly I'm specialized in Alamein war. So I'm taking my tours from Saloum to Cairo. So this is my tour, including that we have many Jews who are buried in Saloum, Alamein, Hadara, Shadbi. But I'd like to ask whether they originally were Egyptian Jews who already joined the British Army, because we have from Australia, we have from Britain, South Africa, from New Zealand, but I always have a comment whether they were here in Egypt and served in the army, or where they already came with their troops to be buried here in Egypt after their deaths.
Good question. I wonder who can answer that. I don't know if we...
Because I always go there with my tourist group, and even was a local Egyptian, and we put the stone and we do the prayers, but it's always, I'm trying to configure. For the Italian, we know that they were in the jail at the time, at the Italian school, and were not allowed to join the army. But for the British, who had a British passport, whether they were some of them originally Egyptian or they came with the troops.
Mm-hmm. We really need a military historian to answer that question. Maybe another program, another day.
We've got a question from Yolande as well, also about Egypt. So perhaps do the two questions together. Yolande?
Yes. I was wondering, can I put a question to, I don't have a good voice. I was wondering if maybe you can repeat my question and handle the answer if he has it.
Shall I do it? Why did the Jews in Egypt, why were the Jews in Egypt not aware of the Shoah until long after the end of the war? I went to school in Egypt until 1956, and we were not taught about World War II and the demise of the Jews.
Yves?
Well, I think they were aware of what had happened right as soon as the war was over. There were people like, there were journalists like Hemsi, who wrote about this in a small pamphlet, a small book. I don't think this was something that was taught in schools. But then again, it wasn't really taught in schools even in Europe for a long, long time. So the elites, the people who read newspapers, who were intellectuals, who were concerned about what was going on, knew about the Shoah. For instance, in the case of my family, my mother had two of her sisters living in France, and they stayed in France and spent the whole war running away from one shelter to the other, each with two different, with two children. And communication came after the war. So people would, the people who would survive the war would come back to Egypt, explain what was going on. That things were known in 46, 47. But it wasn't something that was taught in schools. But as I said, again, I don't think it was taught in schools in Europe at all. Until much, much later.
Okay, I think on that note, we will draw the meeting to a close, Shimon. What do you think? And I would like to, yes, a last word from Yves.
Yeah, just so that we leave with a smile. Italians in Egypt, there were 40,000 Italians in Egypt who were imprisoned. Of them, I think there were about 7,000 or 8,000 Jews. Most of them did not go to prison. One man did, because he was a guy called Moïse Pontremoli, and he was a veteran of the First World War, and it was sort of my country, right or wrong. So he did not want to denounce fascism. So he was jailed for 5 years. But Sir Miles Lampson, who was the British ambassador, governor, if you like, ambassador in Egypt, went to King Farouk and to ask, because the king had a lot of Italians serving in the royal household. Sir Miles Lampson was married to an Italian girl, and to an Italian woman. And he said to King Farouk, look, you've got to give me your Italians. And Farouk said, I'll give you my Italians when you give up yours. And he didn't, obviously.
Okay, right. So David Dangoor, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Yes, thank you, Lyn. And I'll be brief. It's heading up to 11 p.m. in Israel and Turkey. And of course, in Israel, many have had some very difficult nights. But I would like personally to thank all the speakers for their very interesting, informative, and well-structured presentations. I'm really delighted that at last two very important organizations have got together to put on a joint event for the very first time. I'm pleased to see this evening we had so many prominent and active members of the Jewish community worldwide, which confirms the importance of this event. Now, I know both organizations very well, Simon Wiesenthal Center UK. I've been a trustee and keen supporter for nearly 30 years. And all of that is because the wonderful Shimon Samuels, who throughout that time and before has been traveling the world, calling out anti-Semitism, a powerful and effective voice against all manifestations of anti-Semitism. It's a real pity that we don't have 10 of Shimon, though sometimes I think he does the work of 10 people. But I believe from the reactions to some of his postings that result in corrections and taking down, that he is respected and feared amongst many of critics and enemies of the Jewish people. Of course, Harif, wonderful Harif, has also for many years, together with Lyn and Lawrence and their team, have been the main instrument in the UK and other countries of creating much needed awareness of the Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. And of course, Lyn's book has been a great addition to that. But sadly, many people today are still surprised that there were Jews at all in the Middle East and North Africa. So in conclusion, I want to say that many of us believe that this work of both organizations is really very important, not only to call out the past and the present, but to inform in a better way, we hope, our future, our own future and the future of our families. So I'd like to urge all the many people who participated this evening to join the mailing list of both organizations, and of course, to support them materially wherever it is possible. I feel proud that they are doing this work, and the fact that I am a small part of involvement with them, and all of you can feel that in these terrible times, you can do something about it. And please also tell your friends, encourage people you know who might be interested to join the mailing list, and as I say, to contribute. And so now I will hand you over to Shimon to give us the last concluding remarks.
Thank you, David. It's really wonderful what you said about me, and I don't think I'm deserved for it. But in any case, I'd like to just make a statement. In 2014, our UNESCO co-sponsored exhibition, it was named by my wife, who's sitting here, Dr. Yosiela Wasserman Samuels, and it was, if I think also Lyn, you were present at UNESCO when we had.
I was there, yeah.
The exhibition was called originally People, Book, Land, a Jewish trinity, if you will. And Robert Wistrich, Zichrono Livracha, he added the 3,500 years of the Jewish relationship with the Holy Land. The day before the opening of the exhibition in UNESCO, it was stripped of the MENA panel, which Wistrich had created. And it was taken away under the pressure of 22 Arab member states of UNESCO. In the spirit of this Zoom tonight, I guarantee that the exhibition, whenever and wherever it will be displayed henceforth, it will also include the missing panel on the Jews of MENA. So thank you all. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach for Shavuot. May we all enjoy safety, health, and tranquility, and see each other as soon as possible.